What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. Today I'm going to be doing a very big revisiting of an albums list from a video that I did some years back of my all-time favorite albums. And for those of you who stayed with me along the way of making these lists and putting them up on this channel, thank you very much. This is going to be my full, I'd say, definitive list of my top 25 albums of all time. I'm not going to be doing a top 50 because I decided to change things around a little bit. I want to mention a certain band or artist just once with one album, with the exception of the number one spot, which is going to be a tie. So that's the only tie that has been involved into this particular list. And with many cases along the way, a lot of these albums are in different styles and genres. Before I dive into this list though, I want to give a shout out to a very special friend of mine called Cici Bass. She has done a video recently of her 10 favorite albums. That has given me more of the inspiration to talk about why I love these albums that are in this list. Go and subscribe to her YouTube channel. Not only that she's a very passionate musician, but as a bassist, she's always been one of my favorites. She's done a ton of gear videos to live vlogs, and she's just an all-round beautiful and amazing friend. So if you want to see some amazing talent from a younger generation, do subscribe to Cici's channel. So with that being said, here is the list of my top 25 albums of all time. Number 25 is Napalm Death's From Enslavement to Obliteration. This is an album that I decided to put into this list primarily because that this is a band that has given me a lot of the nostalgia. And this was always my favorite album from Napalm Death. And I know they have made, to me, one of the best discographies in metal, but I always cite this one as my personal favorite. Brutal assault onto the fast-paced drumming, to these groovy, addictive guitar riffs. This is the last album to have Bill Steer, who would later on join Carcass. And this is the first album as well to have Shane on the bass, who would still remain as Napalm's bassist to this very day. The last album to have Lee on vocals. I always do admire this cover art as well, as it is one of my all-time favourites. I know that many fans say that Scum is their masterpiece, but along the way they have made other classics like Enemy of the Music Business, to very strong other albums like Utilitarian, Smear Campaign along the way, but this one is always to me the band's masterpiece. Number 24, this album is my personal favourite ambient album of all time, and that is Brian Eno, Ambient One Music for Airports. This was the one that really opened the gates for me to dive in and discover what the beautiful charm and musical approach that ambient music has been for many people. And the more I listened to Brian Eno's music, not just because of his ambient works, but on his other experimental art rock style music on many of his records, it's still amazing to me. And he has done other classic albums along his career, but this one is always my favorite. And the more I listen to this record, it still puts in a very calm and resonating meditative vibe that I could just easily get lost into this type of experience with this album. And I am going to be doing my review of this album for Classic Albums Revisited, but I think that this is an ambient essential must hear and must buy album if you want to get into the genre, just like with others like Steve Roach to Aphex Twin, the other greats. But Brian Eno has been a big inspiration for me, so I do think that this is one of the best ever albums into the overall brilliance of calm, minimalism driven and spacious, open spaces of some of the best music genres of all time. Number 23, this is my favorite album into this particular genre from my favorite krautrock band of all time, Can with Tago Mago. This was the beginning direction that I was getting into krautrock as a whole. By the look of the album cover art, you know that this is really going to fry your brain and eardrums with some very avant-garde to adventurous but schizophrenic, mindless, over-the-top rides of this type of flavor of rock music. There are musical passages onto this album that it can be so creative and very much out there that it takes you into multiple different behaviors because of what the music does to you. And that's what I absolutely adore very much about this album. They have done various classic albums in their discography, like the ambient classic that is Future Days, rhythmic, punchy sounds of Egibam Yassi, which recently turned 50, and I also love Soon Over Babaluma. There are other krautrock essentials from other bands like Faust to Amundul 2 and Embryo, Noi, but this is, to me, my favourite album in the genre of krautrock. And that's why this album is in the list for me. Number 21, this album goes without question. This is my favourite album into the genre of electronic, and that is Kraftwerk, Trans-Europe Express. I know that Kraftwerk in the earlier stages of their career were involved in the krautrock genre, but when they went into the beautiful pioneering world of shape-shifting electronic music put together, they have made essential records like this one. This album for me is my favourite Kraftwerk album, but the one that made me fall in love with the band first was one of their biggest albums in their career, which is The Man Machine, The Robots to The Model, one of the most popular songs of all time from the band. From the positivity on the uplifting Song of Europe Endless, to the haunting, eerie sounds of The Hall of Mirrors to Showroom Dummies, and as well as the medley from the second half of Trans-Europe Express, Metal on Metal to Abzug, to one of these other most amazing instrumentals of all time of Franz Schubert, and perfectly concludes the album with Endless Endless, which is basically like the less than a minute reprise of Europe Endless. This album was always one of my most favourites in the melody side and the production, and I love this album that much. I also got it signed by one of the former band members, Wolfgang Fleur, which was a big specialty. And with this album being 45, it still ages brilliantly. So this is why I think this is one album that has to be in this list. Number 21, this album is from a legendary musician that needs no introduction because this guy was, but still as relevant to this very day, David Bowie, Low. This album is not only one of the other unexpected, game-changing sounds of switching from genre to genre to genre, but I think with Low, this is where Bowie experiences things even bigger than before. Obviously, he went through a cocaine addiction, and he was inspired throughout this time in the mid-70s by bands like the electronic, Kraftwerk, Tangerine Dream, krautrock scene, and this inspiration was very big. So not only that this is nothing like Ziggy Stardust to Aladdin Sane and Diamond Dogs, but the reason why Low is my favourite, it's because it has a bleakness, and with very few amounts of lyrics from the first half of this record to the mostly instrumental passageway on the second half. Brian Eno, as I've mentioned before, earlier in this video, has done some accomplishing textures into these wondrous soundscapes on his synthesizers and keyboards. The rest of the musicians who worked with this album, did an absolutely phenomenal job. I love some of the tracks onto this one, like Always Crashing in the Same Car, to Speed of Life, the haunting Warzawa, to the beautiful masterpiece that is Subterraneans. This was one of those albums that people were very angry towards when this came out, but Bowie didn't give a fuck, as he did release another album to begin the Berlin trilogy at this point in his career with Heroes, and finishing his trilogy with Lodger. But with that being said, with a lot of his albums, this is the best Bowie album that he has created. Number 20, this is another one that I think always ages tremendously, and this one is one of my top 10 debuts of all time for different reasons. Not that this is anything to do with rock or metal, but this one album has to be in here, at least in my opinion. Introducing by DJ Shadow. This was the beginning moments for me that I was discovering something experimental but in a different way. This is a very sampled, packed album, but the way DJ Shadow arranged it and organized this whole thing from start to finish, it is absolute perfection. But what I think is the best moment across this album's journey is that a lot of the material puts you into these different wanders, because some of these beats can be frantic to minimal and quite touching in a way, especially on some tracks like Changeling to Stem/Long Stem and Midnight in a Perfect World, which is always one of DJ Shadow's biggest hits to date, to these other creative and phenomenal landscapes of instrumentation into this different world of music. And Introducing to me is a special album. I definitely recommend this album for those who want to get into more of the trip-hop genre, just like with Fatboy Slim to Massive Attack, and this man is no exception whatsoever. But when I put this album on, I always have a blast with this record. So that is going to be one of those moments for me. Whenever I play this record, it always never ceases to amaze me. Number 19. This album has been my favourite album from this band. It was going to be the previous album, but the more I thought about it, yet alone I've mentioned that I will be doing my own celebration because of this album's 50th anniversary. That is really long overdue, that I need to make my video about this album. The Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street. I think this album definitely was made with not only through the chaos that the band went through, but this was made with a separate purpose, because the Rolling Stones previously on albums like Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed, they were overly dark and very political into their heavy messages. But I think that this album brings the best of both worlds, which was strong musicianship and the biggest amount of variety. So this is not what you would expect from the Stones to go into different genres, because there's a lot of soul, very gospel and country rock driven musical abilities that the Stones had done previously, but they have maximized everything across this album. One of the greatest consistent and memorable musical ability into the Stones as a band. Tracks like Sweet Virginia to Torn and Frayed, Rocks Off, Tumbling Dice, Sweet Black Angel, Loving Cup, All Down the Line, Shine a Light. Everything and everyone knows and what's been said about this album. And along with others like Trout Mask Replica to Blonde on Blonde, this album has been voted highly as one of the top greatest double albums of all time. But I will say that Exile on Main Street has been a big influence on me to discover some more of the versatility from the Rolling Stones. And Exile on Main Street, I say will always stay in as my favourite Rolling Stones album as a whole. Number 18, this album. As we've already heard the news about one of the band members, I wanted to talk about this album as a revisit because I've revisited this album a few months back. This album holds a big place for me in a special way. So number 18 is Fleetwood Mac, Then Play On. This album is the band's best work, and especially for Peter Green, playful and most enjoyable blues rock moments that Peter Green and company did make on this album. I always think that Then Play On is one of those other greatest achievements for guitar influences. Both Danny Kirwan and Peter Green have matched together in the best compelling way possible. And yes, Jeremy Spencer did a great job as well to accompany himself with John McVie and Mick Fleetwood. Tracks like Fighting for Madge, To Searching for Madge, Rattlesnake Shake, Like Crying, Closing My Eyes, Showbiz Blues, which is one of the greatest Fleetwood Mac songs of all time. And you can't go wrong with the two separate tracks of Oh Well, which I think has made Fleetwood Mac even better. Style of the band, and it's pretty psychedelic in places, but this is blues rock at one of its most absolute finest hours, not only from the 60s, but of music in general. This is the 2013 Celebration edition, which contains some bonus tracks, and it does feature some pictures and liner notes. But if you haven't heard of this album, you need to get this album as a must-buy for your collection. That's how much I do adore this album. So anyways, that is Fleetwood Mac, Then Play On. Number 17. Now this is quite an addiction for me into some of the biggest, angriest, pissed off lyrics from any metal band that I know, and that is Cici by Strapping Young Lad. Along with Iowa by Slipknot, I say that this album is the biggest fuck you album ever made. Devin Townsend was at his most no fucks given, everything's pissed at him, most aggressive tangents yet. Gene Hoglan to Byron Stroud and Jed Simon have worked their asses off with this record. Does contain some great cacophony into this whole brutality of this album, from Oh My Fucking God to All Hail the New Flesh, Detox, and this whole album is entirely powerful, not only into this wall of sound that Devin Townsend later on would become famous for, into his own inspiration on his style of production, but the instrumentation as a whole is manic, it's menacing, it's violent, it's punishing, and this is just as vile and vicious as it really gets. And despite what Devin later on was going through with his diagnosis of bipolar and depression, but this is my favourite Strapping Young Lad album, and I think Strapping have made a great mark of albums like with Alien and The New Black to discover Devin Townsend, and for multiple reasons. I think that Cici is one of the best metal albums of all time and one of the best from the 90s. Number 16, this album has always been another classic record into the repeating talks of double album, and that is Electric Ladyland by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Everything has been documented, and I did a classic albums revisited review of this album in particular, Hendrix at his best. It's got his most inspired, trippy, and drenching psychedelic effects. He experimented with tape loops to these other big visuals into his creative mind, that every song on this album just follows in this big package. From Crosstown Traffic to Voodoo Child, Little Miss Strange, and the other popular hits on this album, the Bob Dylan song All Along the Watchtower being covered on here, to which Bob Dylan praised later on, and with Voodoo Child's slight return. But one of the best ever songs from Hendrix is 1983, A Moment I Should Turn to Be. If you want to get into your own journey into psychedelia, like with Purple Haze and Foxy Lady and Little Wing, check out that song from this album. I don't need to say anything so much about this album because Electric Ladyland is as bold, as relevant, and as terrific into this big masterclass of Hendrix's writing and style of production. So that's why Electric Ladyland by the Jimi Hendrix Experience has to be included into this album list. Number 15. Now this album is my favourite from, to me, the greatest jazz musician of all time, and that is Miles Davis with Bitches Brew. I know that Miles Davis has done loads of albums throughout his career. You got the modal jazz ascension that is kind of blue, to the Spanish-tinged flavour of Sketches of Spain, to moving things forward into jazz fusion with Miles in the Sky and another gem of his called In a Silent Way, to later on jazz rock with albums like Jack Johnson, to Live Evil and On the Corner, and live albums like Agharta. But Bitches Brew is, to me, has a separate behaviour. It assaults you in the face and these eardrums to these long, open, big jams. John McLaughlin's guitar work was brilliant on this record, to the keyboards and these bass lines, to these commanding changes from these looping structures. Why jazz rock and jazz fusion has been as prolific as ever, and Bitches Brew is one of those moments that it still sounds as fresh, arrangeable into exploring your own territories. And that is the big part why I think Bitches Brew is, in my opinion, the best thing. And this big double album is one of those other wonderful executions into, like I said, the jams, but it takes you into a different place. And it's another album that I did review for Classic Albums Revisited. Number 14. I've been obsessed with this band lately, but the more I listen to this record, I still tremendously play this over and over again. And not only that, I've mentioned this as one of my top favourite albums from the 2000s included in here, and that is White Pony by Deftones. This album is always one of those albums when you can think that this is one of the strongest and best qualities into this overall writing and the musicianship on here. I do remember these tracks so well that it has become this ongoing, continuous replay type of choice. Tracks like Change in the House of Flies to Digital Bath and Knife Party and Elite. This album, while I do love everything that Deftones had done into the earlier side of their career, I love the other albums like Saturday Night Wrist to Koino Yokan and Ohms. But when it comes into the overall admiration of the band, White Pony is the number one into this band's discography. And I've also done a long review of this with EQP TV, who is a big Deftones fan. Please check that review out if you haven't already. Number 13. This is another one that I see as one of the other greatest debut albums of all time. That is the Stone Roses with the self-titled debut album. This record goes without saying that as much as I love other bands in the Manchester scene, like with some Happy Mondays to the Smiths, and obviously Oasis, but the Stone Roses, to me, along with Oasis' debut of Definitely Maybe, this record is one of those other examples that the Manchester scene is still as artistic with amazing results. The track I Want to Be Adored, the opening song to this album, is my favourite Stone Roses song of all time, and these other phenomenal songs like Shoot You Down to Made of Stone and She Bangs the Drums, its melody, it's wonderfully balanced, and the great playing from John Squire to these indie rock, jangle pop, flavorful musics that they have just painted themselves into. There's no introduction to this record that needs to be addressed, because the Stone Roses debut album is always a sublime and pivotal big record from one of the greatest Manchester bands of all time. Number 12, this one gives me a lot of nostalgia for me, and this was the opening side of me that got into the most out of control and weirdest side of music before discovering many others. But this monster ride of an album, and that is Mr. Bungle with the self-titled album. This goes without saying, this is, in my opinion, Bungle at their best peak. Loads of people will say California, but they have made a discography that has been one of my all-time favourites. The biggest reason why I love this album so much is that it goes off onto this uncomfortable, uncompromising, uneasy, but wildest and funniest tangents that this band can give you. I know that Disco Volante is the most difficult album from the band for many listeners, but this one always grabs me so much into these questionable and these wild cacophonies. Tracks like Quote Unquote, known as Travolta, to Squeeze Me Macaroni, to Carousel, my favourite Bungle song of all time, which is My Ass Is On Fire. You need to listen to this album if you want to challenge yourselves. This goes in to me as one of the weirdest albums ever made, as I've done reviews on this band's discography separately from the channel. But yeah, number 11, this one is from my favourite band of all time, and that is Slipknot. This is their self-titled debut album. Slipknot, to me, have made some of these heaviest and great statements into shape-shifting metal into a massively bigger level. And as much as I think that Iowa is another metal classic in their discography, this one is always the one. Has been played many, many times that I think that this is the best Slipknot album. And yes, this is an actual signature signed by the man himself. Number 7, that is Mick Thompson. Eyelust, Wait and Bleed, Prosthetics, even the controversial tracks like on Purity. But then there's these disgusting and murky, assaulting and torturing vocal performances from Corey Taylor on many of these tracks, like Scissors, for example, to these outstanding performances from the drumming from Joey, to the riffs from Donnie Steele and Mick, the scratching wizardry from Sid and the turntables from Craig 133 Jones, the percussion from Chris and Sean, and, you know, everything onto this record is, for me, one of the best reasons why debut albums like Slipknot's debut album can still be as talked about. I don't need to say a lot of things about this album because I've done very long reviews into Slipknot's discography already, but this album holds one of the best places for me to discover one of the heaviest and brutal sides of music. And now we are going into my top 10, guys, my favourite 10 albums of all time. Number 10 is Neil Young, After the Gold Rush. This was my introduction to Neil Young, and what a beautiful starting point for me. I love a lot of Neil's discography, with Tonight's the Night to Freedom and On the Beach and Ragged Glory, but After the Gold Rush has been the best thing Neil Young has written. It's got that darkness, this bittersweet and yet innocence direction into the melodies, and there's loads of these other songs on this record that is as powerful and as unique. The pristine production from the playing onto these acoustic guitars and simple minimalistic style of pianos, these vocal harmonies were just fantastic. Every song on this album moves along and rolls with it into one of the best music ever written. And After the Gold Rush is one of those albums that brings me such a great big pleasure. Number 9 is Sepultura, Chaos AD. Out of all of these albums, when I listen to Sepultura, this one brings back a lot of memories, as I used to play this album mentally. But with that being said, politically, onto these messages, Max Cavalera have still made these messages in a very big relevant way. This phenomenal amount of material on this album still assaults and punches and grabs the listener by the throat. Andy Wallace's production is still stunning. This record does contain one of my most favourites from this band. You've got Territory and Slave New World. To Biotech is Godzilla, Clenched Fist, and there's many of these other movements from Sepultura later on that they would experiment with some more acoustic guitars and production. And I think that Chaos AD was the beginning point for that. Just like what they did onto their last album with Max Cavalera after this one, which is 1996's Roots. But as much as I do love Roots and the other albums, and it's another one that I see as one of those other albums that you need to get into for 90s metal music. Number 8 is Mastodon, Crack the Sky. This is an album that I don't really need to address way too much, because I am going to be doing a long, in-depth review of this album in a collaborative idea. And yes, that is an album that's signed by Bill Kelleher. And I got the t-shirt to go with it, because this album cover is my favourite album cover of all time into the metal stylistic approaches of artworks. These presentable and artistic, painted, and these sublime elements across these 7 tracks all still is greatness from my favourite progressive metal band of all time. And as much as I do think that other bands, like with Queensryche to Opeth and Dream Theater, have made progressive metal icons of albums, to me, nothing comes close with me than Crack the Sky by Mastodon. And also, I do recommend the making of Crack the Sky, as it's always a brilliant must-watch. Number 7 is The Who with Quadrophenia. Quadrophenia is the ultimate achievable moment in music across double albums and concept albums, in my opinion. And this is The Who go into the highest levels in their own right. It's still outstanding that Pete Townsend has made this entire concept album by himself without the rest of the band members involved, that I always think about and to go into with this overall, dare I say it, amazing journey when I listen to this record. For those Who fans out there, I just made a reference, obviously. But from the opening tracks to the separate themes and the overall story, going into the whole personal side, into difficulty, self-doubt, and schizophrenic personalities, as well as desperation and a deeper crisis of expressions. The music as well takes these emotional things and combine it into this overall crowning goldmine of an album. And Quadrophenia is one album that I will never ever get sick and tired of, along with Who's Next, to Live at Leeds and Tommy and The Who have always been one of the biggest important bands of all time for me, for reflection and remembrance, and Quadrophenia a well-deserving and beloved concept record. Number 6, this is the shoegaze album that not many people will ever be ignoring, because with these other ones that people praise, this band has never been forgotten, and that is My Bloody Valentine with Loveless. As much as the other albums that are classics like Sovlaki by Slow Dive, and also with Ride with the record Nowhere, but Loveless to me was a giant addiction. This is one of those records that puts me into a huge trance because of the whole noisy, distorting, blaring out soundscapes from these fuzzy, cranked up amplified guitars. But to hear these vocals from Belinda Butcher and Kevin Shields, even on these accompanying sounds into this production, still as irresistible in this attachment into one of my favorite genres of all time. And definitely check out Loveless if you really are into these various experiences and guitar effects. And Loveless is, to me, one of those great examples for those reasons alone. Number 5, for me, this is my favorite metal album of all time, and personally now my favorite heavy metal album of all time. I remember when Pantera's Vulgar Display of Power was in my old list, but this one just swipes that one out of the water. But as much as I love Pantera and that album, this album has been on repeat for me, and I just think this has to be accepted into the list. Number 5, Black Sabbath, Sabotage. This is when Black Sabbath were into their experiment phasing into adding acoustic guitars to choir chantings and some more keyboard-driven sounds. And tracks like Megalomania stands right out. And that is my favourite Black Sabbath song of all time. Like Hole in the Sky, this catchy, quite anthemic chorus to it as well. And the classical interlude of Don't Start Too Late, and of course what some people say as like one of the beginnings of thrash metal, to the crunchy opening riff of Symptom of the Universe. And what I love a lot about this album, not only is because it's Sabbath at their most progressive, but they do explore things, and lots of the lyrical ideas on most occasions is basically like their angry response to one of their managers, and Ozzy sometimes on this record does sound at his most pissed off and most anger-inducing behaviour on his highest register. Like with other albums where they went into that phase like Sabbath Bloody Sabbath and Volume 4, etc. But Sabotage was the winner for my favourite Black Sabbath album when I did my re-ranking that I did when I decided to look back at their discography. Number 4 is Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here. This is Pink Floyd in one of their most emotional journeys in what they went through. This album is obviously more or less like a tribute to their former bandmate Syd Barrett, and with the overall theme of this album grabs more onto that expression of loss and this absence. This whole vibe on this album was like, wow. The more I listened to this album, won me as a fan of Pink Floyd. And I did discover Floyd on some of the other albums like Dark Side of the Moon and The Division Bell and Animals. But when I was getting into Pink Floyd and progressive rock music, Wish You Were Here just was one of those that made me speechless. I remember after my first time listening to this album, I played it over and over and over again. And out of all of these progressive rock albums, just like what I said with Mastodon's Crack the Sky as my favourite prog metal album, this is my favourite progressive rock album of all time, and you cannot change my mind. Progressive rock greats, like with Yes to Gentle Giant and King Crimson, many others, and Pink Floyd is unavoidable as well, because arguably, like Crimson, Pink Floyd are one of the most talked about bands of all time in the world of music, and Wish You Were Here is one of those records. While it is not one of those examples in the positivity, this was all this roller coaster in these experiencing and emotion-driven passages of music that I do admire very much. Number 3, this album, a brave result into this musical genius from his mind, and when he worked with the Wrecking Crew, to the rest of his bandmates for this album, to one of these other versatile in its history of music, and that's Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. It is amazing that Brian was 23 and half deaf when he made this album, but into this idea that he had, he wanted to make an album that reflects a lot of these times that he went from his life, from the career that he was going through with the Beach Boys, but in terms of something personal. And I think that all of these pieces that were jigsaw puzzled, connected and attached, all in this one slice of music. It's historical. This album is a wonderful musical testament, not only for Brian Wilson and the band, but of the 60s culture as well. From Wouldn't It Be Nice to God Only Knows, You Still Believe in Me, Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder, Caroline, No, and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. What do we need to say more about Pet Sounds that hasn't been said already? Because there's no other album in this emotional and honest bringing of music that can be one of these remarkable things ever, that comes as one of the highest as much as this. Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys is one album with everything that I do appreciate, and sharing my love very, very much onto Brian Wilson. A lot of the stuff that he puts in so much into his heart and soul, along with the rest of the Beach Boys and the Wrecking Crew especially, to make that giant of an album. Number 2, this one album is, for me, out of all of the solo albums that I have talked about on multiple times on this channel, but in terms of solo albums that I listen to from tons of people, this one, big importance into my listening approach, and that is John Lennon Plastic Ono Band. Out of all of the solo Beatles albums that many of us have listened to, this one album here grabs me with these heartbreaking and painful to raw and sad states. Lennon and Yoko went into the whole Primal Scream therapy, and Ringo Starr did play drums for this record, as well as the other musicians like Klaus Voormann, who was friends with the Beatles, did play bass on this record. From the opening sound of Mother to Working Class Hero, which is my favourite Lennon song on here, and the tracks on the piano to Isolation, Love, and on these these torturous screaming on Well, 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 and the song God always brings me to tears. That is the one song that I was diving in, but to try and hold myself together, but I just always break down. God is the most emotional song that I had ever listened to from a musician that is my favourite. The production on this album absolutely fits. Just like with the sound of Paul McCartney's first self-titled album, with that lo-fi, quite underproduced quality, while this one was recorded at Abbey Road Studios, but the sound onto these jangling, soft acoustic guitars, and the bleakness and the roughness on the drums, to all of these things in between. This album is one of them that puts me in awe. Tear-jerking results of art like that one. Plastic Ono Band by John Lennon has held a big deal for me. And my number one favourite album of all time, as I've said from the beginning of the video, this is the only tie that has been mentioned before, but I'm going to repeat it once more for this video. Speaking of my favourite Beatle, my number one favourite album of all time is the tie between these two albums. The Beatles' Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I will not talk about these albums so much into this video because I will be back to review the Beatles' discography, but when I will talk about these two albums in particular, I will always dive in with so many words, because not only that these albums, to me, are the greatest things into music, period, and it's not just because of the Beatles, but I think these two records, by themselves or together, have been pioneering and what made art as gigantic and as the most stupendous into music. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was the one that got me into my admiration of the band. Revolver has a separate and different character, and to me, out of all of the productions, Revolver takes the spot as potentially, maybe, along with Wish You Were Here and many other albums, the ultimate production album of all time. And with Sgt. Pepper's, this brings in this fictional band idea into life with brilliance into so many of these tracks that were based into its separate story in making music with this fictional band, and every single track is like that they want to show music as like an art gallery but for the ears, and that is what I do think that Sgt. Pepper is, to be honest. But like I said, guys, I won't go into a lot of detail until I will do these separate reviews, but these two for me are always neck and neck and stays with me, because I cannot pick which album above the other as my favourite album of all time, because they are all masterpieces in their own way. And you may say a lot of things into Abbey Road, to maybe the White Album or Rubber Soul. Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's, to me, will always be, for me, the best albums and my favourite albums of all time. So with that being said, guys, that is my list of my top 25 albums of all time. I know that this is a long video, but if you want to share your list with your reasons, please put them in the comments down below. I absolutely will be interested very highly to see and know what your picks are for your favorites of all time, because not only that we love to talk about music with our passion and enthusiasms, but I want to see what you want to say on your album selections with your lists. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I will keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.